Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review season 1 of I Think You Should Leave. This is a comedy show where basically, like, every skit is to be like that awkward kind of comedy where eventually there's points in time where there's little things that get stretched out way too far just because reasonably it's like the more it stretches, the more funny it is. And where eventually we'll just have this person eventually like not understand something, and it'll take like that's the whole skit where it's like somebody doesn't understand something, or eventually like somebody is to just like keep going at this one thing consistently until it just starts to become more and more funny as it continues to go along. uh, but I don't know, I just had fun with this show, and I hope that eventually people will want me to go and watch season 2 because I'll go ahead and watch that also. But yeah, I just had some fun with this. Like, really, a lot of times it'd be like, well, yeah, I'm sure a lot of people could have fun watching this show because they're not the actual person that this is to, like, happen to or whatever. But, like, I don't know, just kind of how they keep, like, going on and on and on about, like, the same point, like, just really just drilling it in is just kind of funny to me. So, with that said, let's, like, I guess we can kind of tee it up for people, like, even though I technically have talked about this already, like, it kind of feels like, let's kind of tee it up and let's kind of mention some certain situations that happen in season 1, and then eventually we'll get into, like, spoilers. So, there are at some points when you have, like, all of a sudden this one, like, beat where we have some like Dawson Creek of a show, and then all of a sudden, like, you could kind of tell that the show is completely stopped because they have to push some ad, some weird goofy T-shirt. There's a part where we have this guy that is so ecstatic about motorcycles. Uh, we have consistently uh, like jokes about like people like going and taking a prank too far, or quite possibly like you think one thing is going to go something but it just exerts into like an overly exaggerated point of just like why did this get so far. All of a sudden they're like it gets into random nonsensical words like turbo and whatever. It just comes out to be like really just like, okay, this went way too far, and then it stopped. Like, it always stops at the perfect time. There's a skit later on in this season where everybody's talking about YouTube videos. So isn't that kind of funny that eventually, like, it kind of talk. I guess they probably figured, well, like, somebody's probably going to review this at some point. And it's probably going to be on YouTube. So might as well just like talk about a YouTube video that went viral, because eventually it'll probably be um, somebody that probably compares like a lot of these skits to like a YouTube video or like a TikTok or something like that. So, but yeah, like, I'm obviously already feeling that I'm like, I feel like I've like talked about this show already in a very vast couple of minutes. And so yeah, like, I guess we'll just go right into spoilers. Let me pause here for a little bit of a reset for a second. All right. So yeah, let's really just get into spoilers. I don't know. I don't have much to say overall, because I think if I talk about this anymore, like, it'll probably just give the show away, and so like I might as well just go into that. If you're hearing any background noise, like weather is happening in my location, so if you're hearing little pats of something, it's rain or thunder or whatever. So, but yeah. So let's get into that double five time territory, because I think it's that coveted time yet again to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time you do spoil this season. So the very first episode is, or the very first skit of the very first episode. We're gonna go into like the skits of each one of these episodes because might as well. Uh, like, the very beginning is to have like an interview that seems to be going very well. Like, I can already tell like this is like some kind of like jobbish interview where the guy's like, man, like let's shake hands and we'll like it'll be great to like work with you and blah. So all of a sudden we all of a sudden have like our character who all of a sudden is to eventually try and open the door, and the guy who was giving this guy the interview was like, "Oh, you opened the door the wrong way." And then the guy goes like, "Oh no, like this is the one door that can open both ways." And so all of a sudden we have this guy who takes the handle of the door and continues to push and push until like obviously like the door is like breaking off his its hinges to like be opened. And so we just have the guy who's like looking at the interviewer is like, ah, and he's like opening the door, and you could tell like the door is breaking, the wood pieces are breaking, but like he's getting the door open. And then so this guy just heads throughout the door, and then the door like swings back the other way, and it's just like, okay, like we had this guy even like spitting out of his mouth, like that's how hard I guess he's trying to get this door open. So like that was a like and like that was to just kind of like show us like how like this is going to be like put together. But I honestly like that skit just because like I think a lot of times you get where people like, hey man, it's push, it's pull, it's push, it's pull. Like there's this one Will Ferrell movie where like Will Ferrell is looking at Zach Galifianakis and like, hey, you're supposed to push it. It's like push it real good, and then Zach Galifianakis walks out. So freaking salt and pepper. So the next skit is to all of a sudden have a guy who needs to desperately call a plumbing company. And so all of a sudden there's these two plumbers that are all of a sudden to go and supposedly use this guy's own bathroom. So his toilet doesn't work and they're using his bathroom. Supposedly both the guys like destroy this guy's toilet that is technically already destroyed. And so all of a sudden they are to like replace this guy's toilet with a non-working toilet, and that's and then all of a sudden we have all of a sudden the two plumbers just on this guy's couch bouncing up and down talking about turbos and all kinds of weird goofy stuff that makes no sense. So this like skit just keeps like going and going on, and I'm just like, okay, what was like it just gets to the point where I guess we just have always in a lot of these episodes we'll just have these like goofy commercials that get to the point of them no longer making sense, because I think a lot of people are just severely annoyed with infomercials or just these kind of commercials that have to have these like stereotypical like approaches to them, and like it's like always just annoying. And I'm great that this show actually like showcases that. So let's move on. So we have a skit called Baby of the Year. Like I like I'm gonna try to like randomly maybe have titles for these, but it might not always be that way. So all of a sudden they are to have this like baby of the year, and but there's to be this one like bad boy who's a baby who's Harvey Jarvis, and everybody's like F Harvey Jarvis, and they're like everybody is just imagining how Harvey Jarvis is gonna sadly die, and it's just like what the is this, like this is hilarious. And so eventually like we have like some of the judges who had supposedly gotten like incentives to eventually just rig this competition, and eventually they had to do an in memoriam where all of a sudden they had to do like all of the people who were babies eventually became old and died, and they had to like mention what way of which that they died from, like a car crash or a throat sliced or whatever. And I'm just like, okay, like this is pretty funny. I enjoy this. Like I'm enjoying it. So like the next one is that all of a sudden there's these three girls that are deciding to go to this place and I guess eat a meal or something like that. And so all of a sudden we have these girls taking photos of one another, and so they're going to like title it something, and then they're going to tag their friends with this. And so supposedly the weird approach to this is to just kind of either insult yourself or insult your friends and just kind of have fun with it. But like, I guess it's like you can't just say on the photo that you look pretty or whatever. And so like all of a sudden they're just like, hey, these gaggles of goons, like, hey, I'm going with them to like party at this place or like eat at this place. Isn't that great? And so all of a sudden we just have one girl who takes that and goes way too far with it, to where all of a sudden like she's like mentioning like these 2 bags of meat and me and like this and that, and like she's going really stretching far with this, and like the girls are just like, well, wait, like who are we, the bags of meat or the other thing? And so like this girl is just not understanding the way that she's supposed to like insult them. Like she goes in very vicious route to where they're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, so they keep trying to just like until this girl just goes like to the point of just saying, yeah, I just tagged you both and I just put that down. And it's just like, okay. Like, I don't know why we had to like insult ourselves that far, but okay, I guess. It just goes in an exaggerating moment. I think it was kind of funny, but like really it just gets more and more weird. So the next one is to have, of course, the guy who ends up playing Glenn from Walking Dead, and he also like played in another like a bunch of other stuff like Mayhem, and like he was also, I think, recently like in Invincible as the voice of Invincible and that. So, anyways, we have this one like awkward gift giving skit where eventually what ends up happening is our main character is to continue to get all these gifts that are like these random things like a wreath or like just odd things that no one is to ever be able to really use. Like it's like novelty gifts or some goofy thing that just seems weird. And this guy every single time is like, wow, this is great. Like, I'm going to use this all the time. Like, hey, look at this gift that I got. Wow, it's great. And so every single one of his friends are just like, well, hey, like, there is a gift receipt. You can return it, and, like, if you want. And so, but this guy's like, no, this gift is great. And so all of a sudden we have one guy in the group that is to all of a sudden just like, well, like, how about you, like, give me back the gift receipt then? And then he's like, what? Like, yeah, how about you give me back the gift receipt? Like, how about you give it back to me if you're going to really love this gift and really just use it a lot? And so what ends up happening is he forcibly has to give back the gift receipt, and then the guy eats it, and then all of a sudden he ends up getting sick from the receipt because supposedly this main character, this main focused guy, all of a sudden was to have like some kind of magpie or not use the toilet paper all that much. And so all of a sudden our receipt eater gets sick, and then all of a sudden he's like accusing him of the whole magpie situation, and to make it even more awkward. And so all of a sudden like the group is just like, well, like, hey, then how about like, because this guy lied about the whole situation, like supposedly, so they're like, well, hey, how about if I eat this receipt because he's not going to return this gift, right? Then if this girl starts to get sick, then like, then it just shows that maybe like the one guy is a liar. And so all of a sudden they eventually find out that he's a liar, and then all of a sudden like everybody just goes out to all just go on to another party, and all of a sudden the guy who accused and ate the first receipt ends up dying in the car, I guess, from like just having just a stomach that was just torn up to the gills. So the next skit is to bizarrely have a guy that is to just walk around just at first to see motorcycles, and it's like, oh my god, like there's a motorcycle, and then he's like, oh my god, another motorcycle, and then all of a sudden he sees a car, and he's like, oh my god, like 2 motorcycles that have a home on it. And then all of a sudden he sees a bus and his mind is just blown. And so all of a sudden this guy goes back into his spaceship that is shipped as a motorcycle. And so this guy is just like, guys, like they have so many motorcycles. And so all this like biker gang looking guys all go and are like, yeah, look at this motorcycle. And like everybody's like, yeah, wow. It's like, what what is this? I love it, but what is this? I love it. Let's go to the next one. So we have this thing called River Mountain High, but it's sponsored by this TC Tuggers. And so all of a sudden we have this like classic Dawson Creek moment where like these two characters are kind of like talking about what other people did in town, and like it's getting really aggressive. And then all of a sudden we have like one guy walk in and he just mentions about like, well, yeah, like if anything, like I've been wearing this TC Tuggers shirt and like it just feels really great. I have a little handle on my shirt to eventually like pull my shirt away from me. Like it feels great. Like it's great that I have this knob on the shirt. And like this is going on through this skit. And I'm just like, wait a minute, what? Like I'm just like, what is going on here? Like we have a whole thing of like what we think is to be like this Dawson's Creek thing, and then it's going right back to the sponsor spot that just is so like goofy and whatever. But like that's not all, folks. We're gonna have more TC Tuggers. Uh, so all of a sudden we have a guy walking in, and he is to be in uh, like this little office, like round table where I guess someone is to try to be funny and have a whoopee cushion on this guy's seat because maybe he's not very liked. So all of a sudden, this guy goes and is to sit on this whoopee cushion, and all of a sudden, he's like, "Oh my god! Like, what was that?" And then he was like, "Oh, like I guess I should go to like the hospital or something." And so he ends up getting up, and he's like, "Oh wait, like you guys left a whoopee cushion on my seat," and then they're like, "Oh yeah, like we did that. Like we wanted to like be a little fun." And then so all of a sudden this guy is like, "Well, like what was the joke? Like cuz like the joke would have been that like I farted like very unnormal than I normally would, and like that's the joke, cuz normally my farts are loud and they hurt people and like they make them sick, and like I probably would have had to go to the doctor and like just to check that my like bladder is fine." But this guy doesn't let it go. It's like, what is going to be the next joke? That all of a sudden like you're going to like put like all kinds of stuff like in my pants and like make me have to go to the hospital and miss my like family photo and and so this guy goes so far into it that he like tells his like superior like, could I just go home because I don't want to get my face beat red, and by the time that I go home have a face beat red for my family photo. And so like his boss is just like, go on, man. And he's like, okay. So just, but then bizarrely next we have the TC Tuggers thing where you just have a bunch of guys all like dancing around like as if they're like all like cool and doing these like poses, and they're like yeah, and they're just like getting down with it, and like it's like a Fruit of the Loom or like a Hanes kind of thing where every guy is just like, yeah, like we're doing it and we're having this shirt on and look at us. It's like yeah. Like it's just what this was weird. It was good. It was weird. So now the next thing is to have like this airplane where we have two characters sitting into a seat, and all of a sudden we have like Will Forte, who I know from Last Man Standing. I've reviewed that whole show basically, so go ahead and check it out. But yeah, so Will Forte goes and sits next to our like main focus character, who's Tim Robinson. And so we all of a sudden have this guy who is to have had a gripe with this character for a number of years, because this guy was once a baby who was on a plane and had cried the whole entire plane ride when this old man was much younger, and it broke his spirit so much because supposedly he had to go and do some comedy show, but like this baby crying through the whole entire plane just broke his spirit so much that he couldn't perform for these people, and it drastically changed his life forever. And so this old man is wanting to seek vengeance out on this guy and try to cry during his entire plane ride. And so all of a sudden this old man like starts whining and crying like a little baby. But here's the thing, the guy isn't sitting in the right seat. Like, he isn't sitting perfectly next to this guy, so he has to be forced to be pushed back into some other seat where he's trying to cry, but like the whole time the guy's wearing some headphones to where he can't hear it because he's so far back. But this guy is just consistently crying through this whole ordeal. So I think this is like the next episode. So there's an episode where we have this magician that brings the guy upstage and is to just kind of mention about balls, how like there's balls in his hand, which ball is it? So what ends up happening is this guy has to pull this trick over on this one guy, and all of a sudden like tell him that the ball is, oh, it's in my pocket. So eventually this guy who had this trick played on him and his wife, all of a sudden they're driving home from this whole ordeal, and he's like, you know what, that magician was really fun, huh? Like, yeah. So all of a sudden this couple goes to bed, and he's like, oh, good night, honey. And so all of a sudden the wife is all of a sudden just like, you know what, that magician insulted you and you just took it. Like, that magician just, like, you know how much money that you make more than he does? You know, like, how could you just let him walk all over you like that? And so it's just like, the guy's like, it's just a trick. Like, like, we had fun with it. And the wife is just like, no. Like, how could you let that guy just do that to you? Like, to the point where she just wants to break up with this man because of how belittled that this magician like made this guy. And so all of a sudden this guy goes back onto the stage because his wife left him with the kids and everything like that. And so this guy goes back onto the stage to do this magician's act. And so all of a sudden the magician is like, well, like, I've seen this guy before, but like, hey, like, whatever, like, he wanted to come up here, so like, hey, come up here. So all of a sudden we have this guy who's like mentioned, I have more money than him, like, how could you have insulted me? And like, and the magician says, well, with the way that you dress, like, so all of a sudden we eventually just have this guy like attack the magician because he ruined his life. I'm just like, I love this. Like, it's freaking, because you know how many times like a lot of magicians have that, like, oh, well, I'm like, there's a lot of times where a lot of performers have the like, I'm better than you mentality, and like, that's okay, because like they need to just like be like the spotlighted person, and like, that's okay. Like, really, everybody, like, eventually, yeah. Anyways, moving on. So so now there is to be this like this room of this group of people, and they are to all be asked about like car improvements, and like there's just a bunch of like photos of random cars all over this spot. And so like now everybody's brainstorming to think of like what could be a better like thing upon a car. All of a sudden we have one random old man who is to all of a sudden talk about a steering wheel that doesn't fly off of his car. A steering wheel that doesn't fly off of his car. And so this guy just keeps mentioning about this steering wheel that doesn't fly off of his car. And then all of a sudden, eventually this guy transitions to all of a sudden like talking about this one guy who drives uh with his mother-in-law. And so all of a sudden like the old man is talking about that this guy should marry his mother-in-law, and that if this guy flinches during a bottle flip that he should marry his mother-in-law. And so this old man does the bottle flip and is successful at it. And he's like, well, like since you flinched during this bottle flip, you need to go and marry your mother-in-law. And like everyone else is like, yeah, you need to marry your mother-in-law now because it worked. You did it. And so everybody's on this old man side, and it's like, where did this turn to? So the next skit is to be a laser spine specialist ad where people are to say that they have problems with their bad backs and that they had to go to a laser spine specialist to get it corrected. And so now, like, we have this kind of generic commercial thing where people are to mention that, like, hey, like, yeah, like, I can go and play with my kid again. And, oh, I can, I can help my wife with the groceries. And we have one guy who's like, yeah, and I can go and rob a bank again or something like that. It's some like ridiculous like thing that continues to it's some ridiculous thing where eventually like there's one guy that keeps going and mentioning he keeps going and mentioning how like he can do horrible things. And so all of a sudden we eventually have this guy who is to eventually mention that he can go and yell at his music guy that is to have who is to have like given him like a not the right song. And then all of a sudden like we have this music guy that is just like, well, hey, like if anything, if you don't like the song, I can just give it to this other guy. And so like this guy is just forced to do this song. And like we have the music director the whole time is like, no, you have to have more passion, you have to have more this, you have to more that. And so the guy is just like, so eventually the next thing, we have a funeral thing happening. So, because those happen from time to time. But we have a new organ player. And so all of a sudden we have this new organ player that, of course, is playing all of the wrong, like, kinds of music for a funeral. Like, every bit of it is all to be just, like, happy-go-lucky. And, like, he keeps dropping these plates and, like, pulling all these, like, weird things all on this piano, like as like all these woo, woo, all these goofy sounds and all that. So we have this like priest who's trying to do this whole like ceremony, and so we have the organ player is like, oh, I'll play her up and I'll do this and I'll play this song. And so like bizarrely, like I could see where like some people could take like, hey, like make a happy songs like have a happy song during a sad moment, but like that's kind of like a very goofy approach during a funeral to have this like happy-go-lucky kind of music being played. So the next one is like people are doing Pictionary. And so there's kind of very common, easy ones where a lot of people can get, where like people doing like, oh yeah, she's from Pretty Woman, and like, oh, Julia Roberts, oh, this guy's played Iron Man, oh, Robert Downey Jr., oh, this one's like, this one's a person I don't even know. And so all of a sudden we have a guy who has to come up with this like absurd, like one of a kind, like Pictionary thing that no one would be able to know in their lives. And because like this guy is to mention about this like the Colbert Show or something like that, or the guy who did the voice for Road Runner or something, or some kind of Looney Tune, and like he's like kind of like going into like absurd kind of references, and so all of a sudden, like this guy is to eventually ask one of the people at the party, like, "Hey, like I have a thing of nuts here. Like, could you give me a nutcracker?" And I'm like, "Nutcracker?" It's like maybe we have like a nutcracker in our attic, and he's like, "Well, could you go and get one?" Like, so this person is forced to get the nutcracker, and by the time that they get it, the guy's like, I'm not in a hankering for nuts anymore. It's like, well, like, do you guys have some gazpacho soup? And so all of a sudden, once they get the soup to give it to him, all of a sudden he complains of how it's too hot. It's like, wait a minute, like, this is room temperature, like, soup. And, like, you're complaining that it's too hot. And he's like, well, yeah, like, you know what? Like, if you have, like, an adjustment of temperature during it, it could probably get hotter, you know? It's just like, okay there, buddy. So the next episode is to eventually transition us into a robot man who, like, he kind of looks like Sigourney Weaver from Aliens, where he's kind of like in this like big robotic like thing of a setup where it's kind of like the forklift thing from Aliens, and so this guy is to be like fighting all these skeletons in this like future of 3050, and like all of a sudden we're gonna see him later on in this episode and what he actually does for this episode. So transition. So we have this lifetime achievement like ceremony being done, and all of a sudden, this guy is going on about how this dog had attacked him. And that we have the person who is to eventually have this dog because it was a service dog. And so this woman is like, I'm sorry, it didn't attack you, it just humped you. And so the guy is like, no, it's obviously that it attacked me. And like the guy eventually says like, well, like it's too bad that we don't have a video covering it, because then you guys would know that it was an attack. And so all of a sudden we have one random guy who's like, well, I have the video because I took it on my cell phone. So all of a sudden we have this video of an obvious like a dog humping a man's head. And so all of a sudden the guy is to play it off like he had still gotten attacked, and like eventually he tries to relate that this lifetime achievement award member like is lying. And so like, it's just like really just bringing down this whole lifetime achievement award thing. So now we have bizarrely like Mr. Scrooge saves Christmas, and so we have this robot man who's coming from 3050 to crash through this wall to eventually tell like Scrooge that he needs to go into the future. And so all of a sudden, Ebenezer Scrooge is fighting these skeletons with his cane and like taking them out. And so you have this guy that is just mentioning, like, hey man, like you got to take this skeleton out before it lays eggs. I'm just like, what the is it? Like it's, I guess, like a play on those usual video games that have those odd or wild themes that don't even make any sense anymore. I guess that's really what this thing is about. So, the next one is to be a date that evidently has this like restaurant rule, because all of a sudden we have this date that is seemingly going well, and so, but eventually I guess the guy of this date is to eventually notice that the girl is taking all the good parts, the nachos. So the guy is going to the waiter and mentioning like, hey, could you tell my girlfriend that there's a restaurant rule that she can't take like all the nachos that are supposed to be like shared between the two of us, like that she can't take all the nachos. And this guy is just like, well, like, what? Like, I would have just said order another thing of nachos, but like, so, like, the guy's just like, well, can you just come up with a rule or something like that? Just like go over there, like, hopefully this guy gets a big tip. So, the guy goes over, the waiter goes over, and it's like, you know what? We do have a restaurant rule that like you can't go and eat all of everyone's nachos if you're to share between two people. So all of a sudden we have this lady who's like, did you like have this guy like come over here and tell us that? And the guy's like, no, like, well, you guys were over there just talking for a while, and then you came over, and immediately once you sat down, all of a sudden the waiter came over and told us this. Like, did you tell him to say this? The guy's like, no. Like, I did what? Like, no. Like, I went over there to talk about the air conditioner that doesn't exist. Like, there's not even a vent over us. And it's like, well, I thought you were going to complain about it. I was going to go over there and complain about the rule. What rule? You didn't even know that the rule exists until now. And he's like, well, I was just... so... So, like, this girl is all of a sudden, like, pulling the ripcord on this whole date. And she's like, you know what? Like, I think we're, like, check, please. And the guy is like, well, like, we're going to be really early for the movie. And she's like, what movie? And he's like, what? Oakley dokley. So, all of a sudden, we have this next skit where we have this guy who is to be followed. This is this car thing. And so this guy is all of a sudden consistently honking behind this one guy. And so all of a sudden when this guy gets out of his car, goes in his home to try to sleep, this guy is still outside in his car honking away. And while this guy is at work trying to do his, like, his thing, there's still the guy outside the window honking away heavily at his car. And so all of a sudden we have this guy just following this guy through his entire day or whatever, till eventually we finally have the guy forcefully needing to confront this guy about why he honks so often. And so we end up finding out it's because that this guy has a bumper sticker that ends up saying honk if you're horny. And so, like, this guy thought that if he honked, that this other guy would help him, like, with his situation. And it's like, no, like, I just did something like that to be funny because I came from a small town. And, like, I thought it would be funny if I just put stuff like that because we do that all the time in our small town. He's like, no, I thought you could help me. Like, don't you have anything in your trunk that is to, like, help me with this situation? And the guy's like, no, of course not. All of a sudden, the trunk ends up flying open. And there's a bunch of, like, adult magazines. So this guy's like, oh, so you lied about all that, did you? So all of a sudden, the guy goes and grabs some of the magazines, but he takes a while because he knows about some of them. So he ends up going into the car, and so this guy goes to his funeral, his, like, friend's, like, funeral, to do this little song, this little ditty that makes no sense, talking about Friday nights and, like, because any song that they're to use is just this, like, goofy song that makes no sense. And eventually we'll get to another scene or another skit that has that. So, the very next episode is to be about a Wiener car that ends up crashing into to seemingly some, like, store. Let me pause here for a second. And so everybody is trying to figure out who is the owner of this Wiener car. And all of a sudden we have one guy who's dressing like a hot dog. And he's like, yeah, who owns this Wiener car? And so we have the cops being called. And everybody's just like, well, obviously it's the one guy wearing the hot dog suit. But there's some guy who technically dresses similar to a hot dog, and it's like, well, what about that guy? And they're like, no, it's obviously you. And so eventually what ends up happening is we have this guy who's like starting to collect all these like shirts all around the store, and eventually he's all chucking them in his car, and he's like, well, hey man, like if nobody else is gonna drive away with this car, I guess I'll take it. And so all of a sudden we just have the cops that are like chasing after this guy, and he's giving him the middle finger and running off. So the next thing is to have this like dinner situation where all of a sudden like these guys are dining and they don't even realize that there is some big celebrity that they're dining with at their table. Some guy named Caleb Went. So we have this guy who is all of a sudden like, man, I hope I don't make a bad impression on Caleb Went, because if anything, like he's the guy that like I'm wearing his belt right now, I'm wearing his like underwear right now, I'm wearing everything of his, and like all of this and that and whatever. So and how like this guy evidently like was a big songwriter or something, like making this guy to be some like Renaissance man. And so all of a sudden like this guy's like, I don't want to make a bad impression, like I hope I like win him over. So all of a sudden we have Caleb who like tries to eat something and it goes down the wrong way, and he's starting to choke. And so now his best friend is like, hey man, like I can give you the Heimlich right now. He's like, no, like I don't want to make a bad impression as this guy's choking. So eventually like his friend is calling the police, or he's calling like the paramedics. So eventually Caleb is like, hey, like what's going on outside? I guess I'd go and check this out, because like I'm gonna like want to see if my car's okay. So this guy goes out there and he gets the Heimlich being done to him, and then all of a sudden like Caleb Went is like watching on as this guy is getting Heimlicked. And so all of a sudden this guy who's getting Heimlicked is just like, oh, like he cares. Like, yay. Maybe I'm gonna make a really good impression after all, or maybe I did make a good impression of with Caleb Went after all. So the next skit is to have a guy in this office mention that like they have a brand new copier, and you know how like they have to like make like such a huge ordeal about some stupid thing that they spent a lot of money on in a lot of places. Like there is like a lot of times where like you have to have a whole entire meeting about what big thing that they like. There is times where I think like a company got sued for like $10,000 because their store wasn't like handicapped accessible, and so they had to do a whole meeting about how they lost $10,000 and how they have to make their store much more handicapped capable. Which I'm like, okay, like why did we have to do like a 10-20 minute meeting about all this? Like, just tell me the new rules and regulations of the store and let me go. Like, let me get out of here so I can go and perform this new regulations of which that we need. I didn't need the whole backstory of the whole thing. Like, but they had to like, they just I guess needed to take that kind of time, which is perfectly okay for reasons. Anyways, so we had. So we have this copier that they, I guess, spent a lot of money on. And so, like, yeah, like, we got this for Christmas. Like, Santa brought this early, this copier. And so all of a sudden, like, the one guy is to make the one joke. And so the one girl, like, tries to, like, reuse the same joke. And all of a sudden, they don't laugh at her joke. And then she's like, well, wait a minute, like, how is it that all of a sudden this guy, like, you laugh at his joke, but my joke you don't laugh at? Like, and it's like, and they're like, I don't know, like, maybe it just wasn't. And she's like, no, like, why is it that you laughed at his joke, but my joke wasn't good enough? And so all of a sudden we just have this one girl who is just so upset, and she keeps saying over and over again that Santa brought it early. And so all of a sudden we have one guy coming into the fray as everyone is back into their like their little cubicles and whatever. So he's like, "Hey man, like I guess we got a new copier." And so the one girl like chimes in, he's like, "Yeah, Santa brought it early." And so the one guy's like, "Wow, like that's actually a funny joke." Like, haha, I liked it. And the one girl's like, like, that's all she wanted was to have one person laugh at her joke, and no one else did but that one guy. And it's just like they kept going at it for I don't know how long about that joke, but it paid out eventually. So all of a sudden we have this like one scene kind of taken from like seemingly like the Walk the Line Johnny Cash movie, where all of a sudden we have this guy who is to do this song, and then like the recording guy is just like, well, that sounds great and all, but like we want something a lot more original. And so all of a sudden we just have these guys going into this like random thing of dialogue for this song that makes no sense. And all of a sudden we had the two like arguing, because two guys just started to randomly like put in lines in, and like the one guy kept talking over and over and over again about like skeletons being like brought out or whatever or something. And like the guy is just like, well, like that's because I wasn't sure how many, like if I said it already, so I just wanted to bring it back into the fold. And like they keep going on and on about this, and it's just like, and the singer already like knew what he was going to go along with. But yeah, uh so the next skit is to be about two guys who are late to a party, and so they use the excuse that their babysitter had made them late to this party. And so they're like, well, like hey, like why was she late? And it's just like, well, supposedly she was involved in a hit and run. She like hit and like ran over somebody, and so like ran over someone, like shouldn't we call the cops? And then the guy's like, no, like because if anything, like the police officers had said that like these guys were like nothing. And so like this one guy who's Barry like keeps asking questions about the whole scenario because he just wants to know more. And then so like this guy pulls Barry aside, and he's just like, you know what, like I want you to stop asking me questions about that whole story, because because I'm just gonna beat you up. Like I'm just gonna beat you to death. Like I don't want you to ask me questions about it anymore. But Barry's like, but I want to know. Like this is a hit and run. This is a serious offense. And so we just get to the point where the guy is just like, you know what, Barry, I'm gonna embarrass you during this party. And so eventually, like Barry is to talk about like the Detroit Lions, and like the one guy chimes in. He's like, "Oh, lions! Like, why are animals playing in a game? That seems weird." And so that doesn't quite work. So this guy just rams Barry into this like china cabinet and freaking like falls over. And he's like, "Yeah, like I told you, like I get you." It's like okay, all right. So the very next episode is to have all of a sudden this old man that is trying to desperately get into this house because of some treasure chest. Like some bizarre like opening of the skit that eventually pays off somewhere later into the episode. So the very first thing that we are to see here is kind of like one of those like another one of those kind of like infomercial kind of skits where all of a sudden we have this couple that is riding horseback, and all of a sudden the wife turns to this husband, is mentioning like, you know what, like you know what I just spotted, like this horse like that you're riding on like has a huge wang, like a huge ding-a-ling. So all of a sudden, like I guess the guy is feeling emasculated because of this horse like not having as big of a wang as he does. So all of a sudden there's to be this one horse ranch that is to specialize in bizarrely having a horse's wang that is about the size of a man's wang. They have to find a horse that specifically has wangs the size of certain men. And so all of a sudden, like we eventually had these people at this specific horse ranch. This horse rancher is mentioning how like seemingly impossible this was to find a specific horse that had the same wing as a normal guy. So, but eventually these guys or this woman is to go in to talking to her husband about, you know what, like this horse seems to have the same size wing as you do, honey. Like I think maybe even yours is bigger. And then the guy's just like, yeah, I'm sure it is. Like just like what the why? Horse wing. Anyways, so that moves us on to this thing called the Mega Money Quiz. This is supposed to be some game show that like we don't know how to punish like our like certain characters because all of a sudden we bring in this guy called the Chunky who like doesn't know how to punish the contestant. And so all of a sudden we have this guy like we have these two characters called Colleen and Paul. And so Colleen is to get every answer right. And so when they go to Paul, which is I think his name is Andy Samberg, we have Paul who eventually goes and like opens this one thing up, and it's to be a Chunky. And so Chunky, this mascotted character, comes out and is to start to like annoy the contestant, like trying to like grab his arm and kind of like try to like mess with him a little bit. And then all of a sudden the host is like, no, Chunky, like you can't do that to the guest. Like you can't just like mess up his shirt like that. And so Chunky is just like, huh? Like, so eventually Chunky all of a sudden, like, we just consistently have Paul who keeps getting the answer wrong. And so Chunky goes and takes like this guy's backpack that he brought from the green room, and he goes and takes his laptop and tries to like destroy the laptop. And the host is just like, Chunky, you can't destroy the laptop, that's too expensive. And Paul is like, yeah, you guys are gonna pay for that. And the host is like, no, I'm not gonna pay for that, I don't have money for that. So all of a sudden, like, we have like Chunky who goes out again and puts the hat on Paul, and it's just like we have like the host that is getting vicious because he's like, dude, you had all summer to think of what you were supposed to do, and like, and you couldn't figure out what you were supposed to do. And all of a sudden the guy starts talking. He's like, you can't talk. You can't talk, Chunky. You can't talk. It is a fake face and a fake mouth. You can't talk out of it. So eventually, I guess every single time there are certain kind of skits that they mention that they're just gonna dump it, but they keep it in, I guess. So the next one is the Have You Seen It YouTube video. So there's a bunch of people that are talking about all these like random viral YouTube videos. And eventually there is to be this one guy who is to not clearly really figure out like any kind of YouTube video that's like viral. And so all of a sudden he's like, yeah, I probably I probably know one, but I probably don't know the exact name of it. And it's like, well, hey, like just put like certain words in there and maybe keywords can be able to pick up the video. And the guy's like, just yeah. So all of a sudden, like, we have this guy who's eventually like crying during this whole meeting because he can't think of one YouTube viral video. So so all of a sudden we have this next skit that is to be about like a baby shower where we have these people planning for this party. And so everybody's kind of mentioning like, yeah, maybe we should have like some kind of this and that and this and that. And so all of a sudden we have the one guy who's mentioning like, hey, how about you guys have some fedoras? And the guy, people are just like, wait, what? Like fedoras? Like this wouldn't fit for this party. Like this is a baby shower. Why all of a sudden we have fedoras? And then all of a sudden they kind of just keep going like, oh, let's go on, just keep coming up and brainstorming. And so all of a sudden the guy mentions about like certain kind of meatballs, and the people are just like, "It's meatballs? Like this is a baby shower. How is that exactly going to fit into food and stuff like that?" And so all of a sudden the next guy mentions about like like slicked back wigs and black slick backed wigs. And so they're like, what are we going to do with wigs? Like this doesn't make any sense. So uh 'cause I'm trying to like speaking of which, oh, there was one thing that I forgot about. We'll get back to it. Speaking of wigs, we'll get back to it. Because I forgot about one skit. Luckily, I remembered it because I'm like, oh yeah, slick back wigs. Um, but yeah, so eventually they just give into this guy and they go and have the fedoras and the slick back wig or the slick black wigs, and so eventually, like people are at this party and they're like, I am so confused. So the last thing of this episode is that eventually the guy is to remember a YouTube viral video, and so it's supposed to be Bozo dubbed over. And so bizarrely, they end up clicking on this one video, and it had like one view, and it's like really hard to find. But then they play the video, and they're like, "Did you just make this video to just come up with something?" And he's like, "No." Like, and so like supposedly the whole video is about like a guy that sounds like him just talking about the whole like what Bozo would have really thought during the whole video. And so it's like, is Bozo like dubbing over himself? And it's like, yeah, like that's what he's doing. It's like, okay, but yeah. So let's go back into the one thing that I forgot about. So there's one skit that I think was in the second episode that was about like a guy who was to have like just a shaved head, and it seems like he has a lot of confidence. And so we have the one guy who is to all the men all of a sudden mention, it's like, man, like I wish I had the confidence that he had. And because we find that this guy has like a toupee on, and he's like, you know what, like maybe I want to like show that I have more confidence. Maybe I want to like just make it look like I'm like starting to lose my hair, but like I don't want to do it all in just one fell swoop, because eventually this guy is just supposedly like in his imagination like take off his wig, and then all of a sudden everybody's like, oh my god, like what happened to your hair, like really viciously like mention about it. And so all of a sudden like we have this one infomercial guy that is mentioned that's like, well, hey, like we have a toupee thing that'll like gradually make you look like you're gonna lose your hair slowly but surely. And so like this guy just like goes through these stages of different toupees that are to slowly make it look like he's losing hair over time. And then eventually like eventually the guy does lose all of his hair. It's like, oh, okay, so like nobody like notices it. So like, and I'm just like, you could have just shaved your whole entire head and no one would have cared. Like, I've done that plenty. Like, there's some times where I, like, drastically change my hair or whatever and people will notice, but, like, and they'll notice for a while. Like, it's a whole, like, week or 2 weeks where they're just like, oh, yeah, like, hair, buddy. Like, it's long or it's whatever. It's like you shaved your head. Like, I shaved my head, I don't know how many times at work. I'm like, hey, did you lose a bet? And I'm like, no, like if anything, like aerodynamic. Yeah, whatever. It's like, who cares about hair? Like, who cares about like if you dye it green or aquamarine or who cares? Like, it's hair. Like, whatever. But everybody has to make a stint about it, and it's like, whatever. Like, who cares? So, uh, but yeah. So let's go into, I guess, the last episode. So, the very beginning of. Oh. Oh no, this is still the very last episode. There's a lot to just go into this very last episode. So the next is to be this big party house like intervention where like guys around like the water cooler, they're like, hey, like, you know what, like we should finally go and like do an intervention for Mark. Like he's really showing up a lot of times just hungover or drunk, and like we should really just finally give him an intervention. And the one girl's like, well, yeah, like you can come over to my place, which is a big party house, and like maybe you guys should bring in some like fun like party foods, and and they're like, but this is going to be an intervention. Like, doesn't that feel like not quite the right place for that? And she's like, no, just come on over and we'll do an intervention. Like, it'll work out. So all of a sudden, so we have this thing where it's like this big outlandish party house where like all the furniture is made to be look like every single like member of the show Garfield, and how like the whole entire like room looks like something from Garfield or whichever. And so all of a sudden like we have people that are like, yeah, Mark, like we're gonna straighten you out, Mark. So Mark sit down, and so they just start going off about Mark's problems and everything like that. And the one girl that owns his house and is like, yeah, like remember that time, Mark, where like you came to my house and I told you Jim Davis's house and it was fully finished, fully furnished, and like, yeah, like so this girl really wants to get across that she like bought this house from Jim Davis, like the creator of Garfield, and that it was fully furnished and whatever. And so all of a sudden we have a guy who is to show himself because this girl is to talk about how Jim Davis had shown up at her house and talked about some treasure chest. And of course, that relates to the very first part of this episode. And so eventually, what ends up happening is this guy is to show up, and it is supposed to be Jim Davis. And this guy is coming in, and he's like, yeah, I voiced Garfield, yay! Like, it's just like, what the heck is this? And so, like, we have Mark who's mentioning, like, that's not Jim Davis. That's the guy who killed Jim Davis. And so, like, the guy who supposedly killed Jim Davis is like, yay! Like, that's just how the show just ends randomly. It's like this, yay! So, yeah, so I guess with that said, I'm gonna get out of here. An hour? I talked about the show for an hour. Like, I guess, like, that's probably why the cryptic thing was so long. But I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.